My name is Marsha Saxton. I'm the moderator of this panel. I'd like to briefly introduce our panel members. On my far right, Rosemarie Garland-Thomson is Professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at Emory University. Everybody here? All right.
Yeah, but Rose was there.
Rosemarie is waving as she enters dramatically. Where her fields of study are feminist theory, American literature, and disability studies. Her work develops the field of disability studies in the humanities and women's and gender studies and seeks to bring an understanding of disability issues and identities to communities inside and outside of the academy. She is the author of Staring, How We Look, and several other books. Her current book project is Habitable Worlds, Disability, Technology, and Eugenics. Troy Duster is Chancellor Professor at the Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy, the University of California, Berkeley, and he is past president of the American Sociological Association. From 96 to 98, he served as member and then chair of the National Advisory Committee on Ethical, Legal, and Social Issues in the Human Genome Project. He is the author of Backdoor to Eugenics. And Rob is a professor of philosophy and in educational policy studies at the University of Alberta. He has been the director of Philosophy for Children, Alberta, there since 2008, a member of the Royal Society of Canada since 2009, and is the principal investigator for the 5-year project Living Archives on Eugenics in Western Canada, 2010 to 2015. I am Marsha Saxton. I teach disability studies at the University of California, Berkeley in the Disability Studies program. I'm a researcher and curriculum developer at the World Institute on Disability. I just want to make a couple of hopefully provocative introductory comments to our panel about so what. I served on the, with Troy, I served on the Ethical, Legal, Social Implications Ethics Committee, ELSI, for the human genome in the early 90s. And for me, as a person with a disability, I found it to be an incredibly infuriating and enlightening experience, an opportunity to witness covert eugenics in action at the level of federal science. Maybe Troy will say a few more about, things about that. I was a child with spina bifida having leg surgery actually down the road on 19th Avenue at Shriners Hospital for Crippled Children, the name then. And medical providers were trying the very best they could in the era of the 50s and 60s to help disabled children have good lives. And the eugenic ideology pervaded the treatment that we were given, the messaging that we were given. And in a way, I identify myself as a survivor of eugenic ideology. Metaphorically, I wasn't sterilized, but repeatedly given messages. For example, when I was 13 and sought information about my own sexuality, I was told by a physician that, quote, my vagina worked well enough to please a man, but I shouldn't have babies that I might produce someone like myself. Later, as a young adult thinking about pregnancy, I met up with a physician geneticist who said, she looked at me and chatted with me and my husband, and she said, gee, if I'd known spina bifida turned out as good as you, I would not have recommended selective abortion as much as I'd done. So I'm an older woman now, and yet from my disabled students, from people who come to my workshops, I hear these stories over and over again in this era. So I want us to encompass the personal pain involved in this topic. And if you're like me, my throat clenches a bit and I start to feel like I want to cry. And I want to encourage you to go ahead and cry if you want to, because that's what that feeling means. You need to. So this deep personal pain affects our sense of worthiness to be alive, our valuing our children and wanting the best life for them. And And this gets mixed up with disability oppression, with racism, with economic disparities, and confuses our thinking and our sense of self-worth and value. So I'm so happy that this conference has built in some time for real conversation and sharing and storytelling, and that will help us clarify our thinking and move forward to take action beyond the conversations. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go in the order on your program. Rob.
Good. I'll try and keep these comments fairly brief. It's really an honor to be here and to be working with the group that we've formed over the last 6 to 12 months, I guess. Very organized, very passionate, very real. And I'm going to make a few brief comments about the project that I've been involved in for the last however many years now. Officially it's 2010 we started, but the history for it goes back another 6 or 7 years, and then just try and make 3 basic sorts of points from that as a way to address this sort of question of why does the history of eugenics matter, which is one of the questions that's asked in the So What panel. So the project involved in the Living Archives on Eugenics in Western Canada was funded by the Community University Research Alliance program. CURA is the name of that, the acronym for that program, which no longer exists in Canada. It's self-funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and it was a grant for $1 million, which is a lot of money if you're in philosophy, as I am, because it buys a lot of pencils. The idea behind the project, it was a kind of, it had ancestors which weren't successfully funded, and it might be interesting just to mention again briefly some of those. One of those in particular was a project that was larger in scope. We'd applied for $2.5 million of funding for a project called What Sorts of People Should There Be? There were 7 of those awarded nationally in the year that we entered the competition, and we were ranked 8th. So we reformulated the project in some sense to be a bit less ambitious and more focused on Canada, because I got the feeling as much as people wanted to promote through the national funding agencies just worldwide recognized research and incorporate all sorts of people from all over the world, they really want to see stuff on Canada done. And so that was partly how we kind of narrowed the focus a little bit more, but we didn't actually do things that differently, because at the heart of the thinking behind the broader sort of project, What Sorts of People Should There Be, was the experience of a number of us in Alberta in encountering eugenics, unfortunately all too close in history for us there. And my own sort of personal move into this was from teaching philosophy of biology, when I would teach a standard couple of weeks on the history of eugenics, and mainly focused on the bad Americans and the bad Nazis. And then realizing, literally midstream, that there were students in my class whose relatives had been sterilized in Alberta. And I was just blown away. I just didn't know what I was doing, of course. That was Tuesday, then Thursday was the next class. So what do? Well, you go back to your department and say, hey, guys, do you know anything about this history of eugenic sterilization in Alberta? And the guys say, yeah, actually, the founding chair of our department was also the chairman of the eugenics board for most of its history. So it gets a little sort of deeper, and really, to cut that part of the story a bit shorter, for me, the real hook was starting to meet through us. I met expert witnesses from the legal cases, starting with the Lilani Muir's case that was mentioned in the presentations in the first panel. There were a number of people in the law school, in sociology, in other departments around the university who had been involved in the cases. Daniel Kevleys was visiting campus and told me he was an expert witness for the Lilani Muir case as well. And in Alberta, there were over 700 cases that were settled out of court, finally by the province, but not before they had struggled for many years to fight against those cases, including introducing a little-known piece of legislation which was pulled from the floor of the provincial parliament just 24 hours after it was introduced, which tried to basically invoke what's called the notwithstanding clause of the Canadian Constitution to limit the payments that would be made to, as the Premier at the time put it, those people. And it was kind of a disgusting move on the government that just added further sort of salt to the wound that had already been laid by that history of sterilisation, which again, it was mentioned this morning, only ended formally in 1972 with the last change of government that we had in Alberta. So that's some of the sort of background, and the scope of the project really was a little bit unformed. We tend to do things on the fly a little bit. Our hope initially was to get a hold of a lot of the legal documentation that was around. There's roughly 40 linear feet. If you're an archivist, you know that's a lot of material, mainly made up of personal materials and expert witness reports and other materials gained by legal discovery, which we're not officially allowed to have or know. We can know of its existence, but we can't actually look at it. So of course, officially we don't. And, but we're trying to get that material released to preserve the historical record. And it's very powerful material, so I'm told, by people who are allowed to look at these things. But that looks like that's not going to happen. What's shifted and what's become more central to what we've been doing is community outreach, student engagement, and collecting these very powerful survivor testimonies and survivor narratives. So you saw a sample from the very brave Glenn Sinclair this morning, and we have a number of those that we put together in a film. We had 9 that we showed very recently, 10 days ago, and that film now is back in production. I can't say reproduction, that might be a bad pun. What they do is they blend together. You've got different sorts of narratives. So you've, again, seen one example, and there are others of survivors who went through, lived in places like the Provincial Training School. But there are others with people parenting around disability, as Nicola said this morning. And by putting these together and juxtaposing them and using the power of those personal stories, it really gets people to think about the broader sorts of contexts in which eugenics is operating. And that's the kind of thing that's being carried on today in a very sort of high level already, and I'm sure will continue. So one point that I want to make here is that in the history of eugenics, these survivor narratives themselves, whether you construe them narrowly or broadly, represent an amazingly powerful and insightful looks at a past that is not otherwise very accessible, partly because of freedom of information and privacy legislation. And I don't know what they're called, different things in different places. In Alberta, it's FOIP, Freedom of Information Privacy, which some people say really means fuck off, it's private, which means that you can't access a lot of the documents that, in some sense, you should, even with the permission of the people whose files, for example, they are, because they mention other people, right? You can't get access to them. And so we found that the survivor testimonies do provide a way into, if you're careful enough, really providing a bit more of an insight into some of that past that's inaccessible. I remember we were at a conference a couple of years ago, which was called The Study of Eugenics in Uppsala. A number of people from our team were there. We're about 25 or 30 people altogether. We're just 2 or 3 at that conference. And as some of you may know, there's also an unfortunately very rich history of eugenic sterilization in the Scandinavian states. And there was a fairly thorough looking at this by a number of historians across the 4 countries involved there, including Finland as the 4th. And it caused a lot, when this stuff came out in the mid-90s, I think it was, it caused a lot of furor because of the high rates of sterilization that were reported, especially in Sweden. Some of this was very misunderstood. I won't get into that here, but one of the people who I'd been reading for some years about this, and I was really pleased to meet, just a talk I was giving on the project said, we've got sterilization survivors in Sweden, because they're sterilized until about 1975, I think, in Sweden, but we never thought to talk to them. What? And as a bit of an outsider, I'm not a historian, I'm not really qualified in any of these areas, I just saw something to do. And that seemed to be given that we had a buy-in from people in the disability community, broadly construed, and people who were willing to work with us, that seemed the natural place to start. And as the project has shaped up over time, we've seen the real power of these narratives. So one thing I want to emphasize about them is not just that they're important to the sort of collective story that we tell and have voices included that otherwise wouldn't be, but they're also, I think, a form of empowerment, this kind of self-narration, the stories that people tell themselves. But it's also it's a double-edged sort of sword here in many ways. These are traumatizing stories for people to tell. They're not so traumatizing they can't tell them. If they're brave enough to come up and tell them, we shouldn't get too carried away ourselves. I mean, often I've seen some of these stories being told where everybody in the audience is weeping, especially me often, but not the person telling the story. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well, right? There's a way in which it's not that it's problematic. I mean, you do have to watch out. I mean, you have to be careful. You're working with people who often have these very traumatic histories of exclusion and abuse and not being taken seriously as a person. but you also need to respect that they're willing to tell their sorts of stories, and I think that's one of the things that's not been happening in reactions at the, say, my university's level, who are very reluctant in some ways to have these stories told because they're so deeply implicated in their history. There's a kind of institutional complicity and, frankly, a lack of courage, which I find also very disheartening at times when I think about it in the bigger picture. But remember that kind of, the concept that I've sort of introduced to try and understand this a little bit more is the thing that struck me in becoming friends with a number of survivors and other members of the broader community here was this idea of engaged individuality. People who are their own individuals and they have these idiosyncratic weird stories, and there are some strange things that are part of Glenn's mix that you would have seen. And that's a compliment for me. They're strange in the way that each of us is strange in our own different sort of way. There's not just one sort of trope here. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. And I contrast it with the lack of engaged individuality when I think about the people who are on the eugenics board, again going back to this personal connection through my institutional affiliations, because I don't think they had that real feeling that makes someone truly human. They just stamped people through time after time on this eugenics board, where it was very clear the information they had in the files to make these decisions about whether to approve sterilizations were massively sufficient to reject the cases, and they practically never did. Okay? And again, that's one of the lessons coming to the third theme from Alberta. The other part of this is the continued subhumanization of people who are thought to have cognitive disabilities. And I was pleased to hear something that Alex said this morning, which I guess has been said before, but it was nice to have it up front here, that I think intellectual or cognitive disability in some sense is really at the heart of the eugenics movement in a way in which it's not that race, ethnicity, gender aren't, there are all these different sorts of dimensions, and I think the way in which the history is sometimes told in the US, race and ethnicity become very, very prominent, and certainly much more prominent when you think about policies concerning marriage restriction or policies concerning immigration. But when you look at the sterilization legislation, if you look at all 32 or 33 jurisdictions in the US, I don't think a single one of them mentions race or ethnicity in terms of its sterilization legislation, so I've been having a look at that a little bit more. But what is thorough there is this way of dismissing people as people, and on the basis of some kind of intellectual disability, so feeble-mindedness, idiocy, imbecility, being a moron, and so on. These are all the characterizations you find in the explicit legislation. And it's a way to keep people out of the story, out of the collective story that we tell. And one of the ways in which I think that the individual stories have a real power is by showing, literally showing, that there are people in these, if you like, subject positions, to use some fancy term that apparently people in the humanities and social sciences use a lot, they've been thought not to have a subject position. They couldn't narrate their own story. They couldn't tell what it was like. They can tell what it was like. And sometimes it's because they didn't have the intellectual disabilities they were thought to have, but sometimes it's because they did. And that itself raises broader questions for us, I think, as a community in terms of how we think about what matters to being fully human. The last thing I'll just say in less than 1 minute is that although the Sexual Sterilisation Act of Alberta was repealed in 1972, there was never what I think the survivors themselves typically considered to be a proper and full apology. There were some expressions of regret and so on, and my university has never apologized, never really even acknowledged its own role, and it was deeply involved, not just the founding chair of my department, who was also the longest serving provost in the university for over 30 years, was the chairman of this board, but they provided surgeons, they provided other members of the board. The first person who was actually a geneticist was appointed to the board in 1961 after it had been operating for 33 years. And that was somebody who was an expert witness in Leilani's case, who still thought that they should be sterilizing people now. That is 1995. Okay? And I think those kinds of connections, institutional connections, need to be acknowledged and fully realized in order to move forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Troy Duster. Great.
I'd like to begin by asking a question. Under what conditions does a culture or society make the determination that its members should or should not prevent the birth of a child or later on sterilize certain children? And the two different models. One is a public policy decision. And here the best example is China, where in the last 3 decades it's been a clear policy to have only one child per family. But more subtly, there are cultures in which there is a social opprobrium around certain kinds of births, and for example, India, and to a lesser extent China, have long had sex selection, so a lot of infanticide in those cultures. I think that distinction is vital for us. The distinction between a policy of the state versus a kind of membership, in some sense, on one level, voluntarism, to prevent certain births. And I'll come back in my conclusion to say why that may be relevant to this question about so what. Well, the eugenics movement of the early 20th century grew out of a very fertile economic, social, political soil. It didn't just happen. At the end of the 19th century, that 40 years in the last part of the 19th century, this society went through what Polanyi called the first great transformation. And what he meant by that was, in the early part of the 19th century, we were mainly an agrarian, agricultural, rural society. We had cities, but it was before the Industrial Revolution. The last part of the 19th century, we saw a dramatic increase in industrial factory development. And what this did was to produce a situation of dramatic rupture from the lives of people who had ordinarily been in agriculture or farming. Farm to city on the one hand, 12 million immigrants from Europe come into the country in this period, mainly from rural areas, not from cities, and they're drawn into factories. And this great transformation from rural agrarian to urban industrial really shifted the whole framework of people's lives. And it disrupted them and produced a lot of poverty and slums. And in this situation, you found lots of physical illness, mental illness, crime, gangs, and so forth. So, and people were trying to understand the sources of this shift, the nature and character of poverty and its implications. They began to develop theories. And one of the theories had to do with hygiene. And hygiene and eugenics are twinned at late 19th century, early 20th century. So those who wanted cleanliness thought cleanliness was also about the gene pool. And that convergence is important for us. Indeed, as we heard this morning, the progressive movement contained people who thought in terms of these two connections, that get rid of the slums, get rid of all this misery, have hygiene, and then hygienics, and then eugenics were all developed together. It was legitimate to, therefore, sterilize boys in these particular homes for delinquent boys, to sterilize poor women in mental institutions or in foster homes. And of course, most of you know that in the decision in 1927, the Supreme Court ruled that these sterilizations were indeed legitimate, constitutional. What you may not know is that Buck v. Bell is still on the books as precedent. It's never been overruled. I want to draw a parallel now between the first great transformation, late 19th century, rural, agrarian to industrial urban, and late 20th century, an unlikely parallel. Well, beginning at mid-century, 1950s, 1960s, America began its second great transformation from urban industrial to post-industrial, tertiary society. So what's happened, and also increasingly suburbanization, and what this did was to, as in the first great transformation, disrupt people's lives dramatically and produce a situation in which people were suddenly displaced from their ordinary conditions of factory workers, industrial development, and the tertiary society. Currently, I think our situation, we're about 4 to 5% agrarian and rural agriculture, about 9 to 10% industrial, and the whole economy is therefore what's called tertiary sector. Now, this transformation in the late 20th century is a parallel and I think a fertile soil for rethinking how we get around the problem of a lot of poverty, a lot of crime, a lot of mental illness, physical illness. And you start to hear language like this. There are moochers, there are takers as opposed to makers. And that language is a fertile soil for talking about how to get rid of those people or minimize their capacity to influence the rest of us. So it's an us and them, and this great transformation provides a context in which we begin to see how thinking about those people can produce a circumstance in which we do not want any more of them. Now, it's a big leap to say we move to something called sterilization or certainly eugenics policy. But I do want to make the point here that this kind of thinking is a fertile soil for how to think about getting rid of people. We know, of course, the mass incarceration figures of the last 20, 30 years, the whole question about the war on drugs. In 1954, for example, youth unemployment for whites and blacks in the age group 17 to 21 was equal. Let me repeat that. 1954, we had equal unemployment levels for black and white youth. 40 years later, unemployment levels for black youth were 4 times that for white youth. The war on drugs becomes emblematic, a kind of symbolic representation of this notion that we're going to find a way to solve the problem of all this youth unemployment. And it produces employment, of course, for those who are prison guards and those in the industrial, quote, the new sector. So for what happened in the last 20, 30 years, as industry moved out of the country, it moved to Mexico or Indonesia or Korea or to the suburbs or to the south, that displaced the capacity of urban black and Latino youth to have jobs. They become, as they say in England, redundant. That redundancy produces a situation which we're now seeing of all this massive unemployment and poverty. That's the fertile soil for thinking about how to minimize the problem. Jim Crow, the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, the work of Mark Maurer and the Sentencing Project, all of these talk about the problem. But what I want to emphasize and now conclude with is the whole idea that certain, quote, kinds of people are the kind of people you don't want to have in your society. And that's the fertile ground for thinking about eugenics. Now, Marcy said this morning that we need to rethink the whole notion and not get into a trap of saying, early 20th century, that was eugenics, and we don't have that anymore. Well, it's true. We don't have anything resembling state policy. But we should be very mindful of the fact that as we begin to think about moochers and takers and what that means in the society, we have this fertile soil for a new kind of thinking about how to prevent people from being born, or if they're born, finding ways to prevent them from reproducing themselves. Thank you.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay.
Rosemarie is next.
Thank you. I want to, is this on?
It's on. I'm going to stay seated here so I can work with all of my devices in making my presentation to you here today. I want to call attention to access, which is something that we typically don't call attention to because access should work smoothly in the background of all of our environmental spaces. But what I am doing today is giving you an example of something I am working to develop myself, and that is a useful way to make accessible academic presentations. And my concept here is to present multiple formats. So I'm going to present multiple formats today in my talk. That is to say, I'm going to be voicing my talk at the same time that I am going to be presenting images which are not essential to the talk, but rather are augmentations to the talk. And it requires a little bit of coordination that I'm hoping I can pull off without it being distracting here. So let me begin with Okay? Reminding us of our title here, So What? The Consequences of Misremembering Eugenics. And I'm going to start with a reminder, and that is the reminder that people with disabilities have always been a part of the human community throughout history and across cultures, and they have always contributed to making culture and to making the societies in which we have lived. So that's an important premise. I want to talk about three things with you briefly today. One is what is sometimes called the Old Eugenics. We've been hearing narratives of the Old Eugenics. I'm going to recapitulate that a little bit today. And then I'm going to talk to you about what Daniel Kevles has called the New Eugenics. And to try to explain a little bit about some of the directions that the New Eugenics is taking, in particular something called neoliberal eugenics. And then I want to end with what I think of as a counter movement to eugenics that is coming from the disability rights movement, which is part of the larger civil rights movement, and it's also coming from a cultural and academic undertaking that we think of as interdisciplinary disability studies. So I'll try to tell you more about that later. So let's start with the concept of the Old Eugenics. I'm going to offer some careful definitions of the Old Eugenics that will augment what others have said about the Old Eugenics today. The important thing about the Old Eugenics, I think to understand, there are many important things. First of all is that it is a way of thinking, a logic, an ideology, and a set of practices that arise out of that set of logics and ideologies that's actually quite specific to history. That is to say that it is characteristic of a way of thinking and a way cultures have developed in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Now, one of the things that we think about what I'm calling or what has been called the Old Eugenics is that it is an historical period that began in the late 19th century and that was developed primarily in the US and in Europe, in particular in Germany, and that it was a misguided set of policies and beliefs that developed through the first part of the 20th century and moved into the 1930s and came abruptly to end. It had various points, such we've looked at the Buck v. Bell decision in 1927. We know that eugenics had a great deal to do with racism as it was developed, certainly in Jim Crow in the US and elsewhere, that there was a vibrant time of eugenics, certainly in the US and worldwide, where we had things that seem so ridiculous to us today as baby better contests and fitter families contests. And the other thing we learned about eugenics is that it was about the distribution of resources and that eugenics was carried out most fully. This is our narrative of the Old Eugenics. By the Nazi regime in Germany, and that disabled people, along with people from other ethnic backgrounds such as Jews and Sinti Roma people, were rounded up by the Germans, and there was a propaganda initiative to discredit people understood as useless eaters, people whose lives were understood as not worth living, and that these people were institutionalized either in care facilities, people with disabilities, or in what we think of as concentration camps, and that eugenics came to an end at the end of World War II with a recognition of the atrocities, the mass exterminations, the eugenic euthanasia, and the ethnic euthanasia that we think of as the Holocaust. So that's something of the narrative of what is sometimes called the Old Eugenics. But I want to offer a slightly different understanding of both the old eugenics and what Kelblis has called the new eugenics by pointing out that what eugenics is that it is modernity, or our modern era, these last 2 or 3 centuries. It's a sustained commitment to eliminating disability from the human condition. And so in this sense, eugenics is very much, as a way of thinking and a set of practices, it's about controlling the future. In other words, eugenics is the ideology and the practice of controlling who reproduces, how they reproduce, and what they reproduce in the interest of controlling the composition of a particular citizenry. And I think both of the presentations, as well as the earlier panel this morning, reinforce this concept of eugenics. So it's not necessarily a limited and misguided set of historical circumstances from the first part of the 20th century. Eugenic logic, I would say, tells us that our world would be a better place if disability could be eliminated. It's a set of practices and policies enacted worldwide that range from segregation to extermination, as I've suggested, and the aim of eugenics is to eliminate disability, as I've suggested, and by extension, disabled people from the world and from communities. Eugenic logic, and this is really important, is a utopian effort to supposedly improve the social order. And in this sense, eugenic logic is understood as progressive. In fact, it takes place worldwide most vibrantly in the era that we now, we historians call the progressive era. It's a practical health program, it's a social justice initiative that seems, and this is really important thing, and seemed common sense to most people, and it's supported by the logic of the modern era itself. In other words, eugenics is a way to control populations, it's a way to control people, it's a way to shape human communities through technologies. Okay? So let me talk a little bit about this new eugenics that is a part of what I call eugenic world building. And eugenic world building is primarily carried out now through practices that we think of as genetic screening, prenatal testing, a whole variety of scientific and medical initiatives that would shape human communities to make them conform to the values that those communities have at the particular historic moment and time in which those values are held. Let me give you a specific example of how the new eugenics is playing out right now. This is an article, it's a picture of a man named Alberto Costo, who wrote an article in the New York Times Magazine within the last couple of years about the funding that he is seeking for research that he's undertaking that would develop treatments to improve the quality of life of people with Down syndrome. And his article in the New York Times Magazine points out that he is in a losing race for funding, with projects which are funded to develop earlier, less invasive, and more accurate tests to predict so-called genetic defects and genetic anomalies such as Down syndrome that would identify and mark people being born into the world that have the characteristics we think of as Down syndrome, and that is a set of characteristics that his daughter, who I'm showing here, accompanying him in this photograph, that his daughter has. And so this aspect of funding is an extremely important aspect of, and support and distribution of resources is an especially important aspect of the new eugenics. I'll mention very briefly a strand of the new eugenics that is sometimes called neoliberal eugenics. It's being put forward in the field of bioethics and medicine. Here's an example. It's a book called Should the Baby Live? And it is written by Peter Singer and a colleague who is a bioethicist at Princeton University. an endowed bioethicist. And he argues here that, and I quote, "We think that some infants with severe, so-called severe disabilities should be killed." And he has maintained this position not as an outlier position, but a very logical, kind of well-developed position for neoliberal eugenics that's widely supported by bioethicists and within the set of practices, conversations, and values of medicine and bioethics. And here's a picture of Peter Singer. I want to wrap up rather quickly by suggesting that there is a counter argument to neoliberal eugenics. Neoliberal eugenics is a utilitarian argument about distribution of resources and about population shaping. And I call that argument the argument for conserving disability, and I find that argument in lots of places. One place I find it as a disability studies scholar is in disability life writing, and I'll talk just a little bit about that in my remaining time. But the other place that we find the argument for conserving disability is in the built environment and the set of practices that come from the larger civil and human disability rights movement that has worked toward using the logic of civil and human rights in reference to people with disabilities, that has endeavored to make an initiative which I call an inclusive world-building initiative. And here's a photograph, for example, of one of the elements of inclusive world-building, and that is universal design and the kinds of accessible built environments that now are prevalent in certainly the United States as a result of the legislation that is part of the entire disability rights movement and the legislation that has come from that. Accessible built environments are with us in many spaces, and they are not as apparent as they often could be, but they are responsible for bringing people with disabilities into the public space who never would have been able to be in the public space in the past. And they are responsible for an increased diversity and inclusion in public space that never existed before, that is a counter-eugenic move that exists at the same time that the new eugenics exists. And it is our obligation and political commitment, I think, as people who are involved in the knowledge-building initiative of disability studies in one way or another, to bring forward various forms of inclusive world-building and anti-eugenic discourses, let's say. And let me give you just in the last couple of minutes, I have one example of this that I've been working on a bit myself. And that is, as I mentioned, disability life writing. This is a image of a book cover and an image of a New York Times Magazine cover on which we have the photograph of Harriet McBride Johnson. She's the author of a piece of disability life writing, a collection of personal essays called Too Late to Die Young, which is a wonderful title. She was a disability rights activist and lawyer who lived in Charleston, South Carolina, and she debated Peter. All right, I'll finish up. It's my access feature, temporal access. She debated Peter Singer at Princeton University famously and wrote about this in the New York Times Magazine in the article called Should I Have Been Killed at Birth? Very provocative article that I hope everyone will have an opportunity to take a look at and to do whatever it is you can do with that. And she made basically the argument that life with a disability does not make one worse off, which was the rationale that which is the rationale that Peter Singer and his followers in neoliberal eugenics used to argue for the eugenic euthanasia in many forms of people with disabilities. And she says basically the presence or absence of disability doesn't predict quality of life. This is her argument. And I'm going to leave this here with that concept, which is a concept that many of us working in disability studies are working toward bringing forward. And Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Rosemarie. We are now going to move into our discussion groups. Milton, are you going to reintroduce the process?
Thank you,
So
Emily.
we should go back to our groups?
Yeah, so I'm going to encourage the panelists to join the tables if they will. And so on your tables, you'll see, in this case, it's a green sheet, so we're going to flip the script a little bit, and we're going to give you a little bit a different way of approaching this. And so, again, I'm going to encourage folks to do a little bit of journaling or writing to capture the thoughts beforehand. But the title of the strategy is Save the Last Word for me, and it's pretty straightforward. So after some period of journaling, let's take 2 or 3 minutes or something like that, you at a table will be numbered off, or you do it in a numbered off fashion. So the way in which it works is that the first person number 1 will read one of their quotes or something that's come up for them in listening to the panel. And since we've all heard the same panel, every other person at the table will respond briefly, again, not a dissertation length response, but a short response in terms of what is provoked by what the person number 1 shared. And then person number 1 will share why they chose that, right? Chose that piece or surface that from the paneling. Then person number 2 will just share a brief quote. 3, 4, 5, and 6 will comment on it, and then it'll come back to person 2, and they can share why they chose it, and then you just simply repeat that process. This one will probably take the longest to go around, so if you're in a really large table, you might bifurcate the table or create 2 groups, but I also would encourage us to maybe just move the process quickly so that we can all sort of add our voices to it, and then it'll, again, sort of move into more of an organic conversation. And then at some point, we'll do the same process of harvesting these nuggets, returning them back to the panel, and then we'll move the conversation forward. If you get lost, you have facilitators at each table, and you also have the green sheets to serve as a guide. So what I'm going to encourage you to journal about is what's something that's pithy or thought-provoking that was surfaced in the panel that you'd like to talk about. I encourage folks to maybe surface 1 or 2 things, maybe even as many as 3. And our goal is to be done with this part of the process at 2:05. Thank you, Emily. All right, so come on back. All right, so we're going to go through the same process, and again, we're going to harvest some nuggets from the smaller conversations that have been taking place at the table. And I recognize that of all the strategies, this one is one that's perhaps most challenging for folks because it really structures the way in which we speak and listen to each other, but I also think it really is also about cultivating certain kinds of competencies. If we are going to build a collective movement or a community of conscience, how do we begin to be together and hold space together? So I think there's some intentionality behind that. So with that said, we're going to take a few moments to gather some nuggets from the conversation, and Emily will keep me on point in terms of the time, and then we will, again, return back to the panel and give them an opportunity to respond to some of what you've generated. So I would love to hear from some folks. So raise your hand if you'd like to surface a question or some distilled nuggets from your table conversations.
Over there, Mum.
I'll start over here and then I'll fan it around. Thank you.
So we were talking about the new eugenics, really. Does eugenics still exist? And a lot of people might say, no, it doesn't anymore. That was something that came from the past, but what we have to be careful for is that it's just packaged in a different way now, whether it's through legislation or in the doctor's office. It's still out there, but it's got a new face to it.
Great. Keep your hands high. I know. Montel it, this case.
I was particularly struck by the quote that Dr. Garland-Thomson shared with us, that the presence or absence of a disability doesn't determine quality of life. And it really dovetails with the current psychological scientific research. Study after study shows that people with disabilities don't report a quality of life that's inferior to people without disabilities. And yet studies also show that people without disabilities predict that people with disabilities consistently are depressed, abuse substances, have suicidal ideation, and so forth. In my own research, I found that people with disabilities were not less happy than lottery winners. And And yet, that reasoning, thinking that people would have a lower quality of life is, I think, what undergirds this idea that it's not a life worth living.
Great, thank you. I saw a couple other hands. Let me just.
Hi. So what we talked about, what a lot of our conversations boiled down to, was discussion of choice within culture, and how kind of the new eugenics has taken a form where it's about individual actors making personal choices that are all valid because it's my personal choice, it's my body, it's my kids, it's my house, versus a system where it's top-down institutions dictating with absolute authority, and how we had some discussions, how do you challenge that? How do you say to one person, your personal choice is wrong, when you're in a discourse where, or an environment where it's all about the individual, and how do we kind of resist that without playing into the same individual obsession with individuality?
We actually had sort of wanting some more information from Rosemarie, if she wouldn't mind. The idea of disability life writing, sort of more of an explanation of maybe if it's a new genre, and maybe more examples of what to sort of read and what to look into.
Hey there. So in our group, we talked about the child of the scientist from, I don't know where it was from, but her name was Tihi, where in Greek Tihi means luck, and especially it's like kind of like good luck. And we touched upon the notion that of disability seen as something very negative, and recently. People starting to realize that, there are so many positive things that come from disability, and maybe we should touch upon them and break some of the stereotypes that are out there that, you're disabled, that means you must be experiencing negative things. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you.
What really resonated with me is the problem of people, the theme that keeps recurring in everything that we've been talking about today. And this gentleman talked about the incarceration of individuals that commit crimes and things like that, and keeping them from reproducing or keeping these problems from reoccurring. And that got us into a discussion more about what gives the right of certain user groups to determine, or not user groups, but certain groups to determine what other groups are allowed in our society or allowed to participate in our society. And to me, it all comes back down to the innate thinking that we have of problem solving. We're always looking at things that go wrong and how to prevent them from recurring, how to prevent people from reproducing in our society, instead of looking at what the end game is, what the goal is that we actually have, and how do we create this environment or this society that is welcoming, that is inviting, that everyone can be a part of and be whatever we deem to be successful, be successful in. And if we rephrase these questions or this methodology of thinking into an appreciative standpoint or strengths-based thinking of, this is what I want to achieve, these are what our goals are, and what we want to provide, we would have completely different results, because the questions that we ask determine the results that we find. And we talked a lot about that.
Others who got some more time, we could surface a few more things.
We had a really rich discussion and only had time for 3 of the, I think, 7 people around our table to give their initial statements and then reflect on each of those. So the first one was that trying to understand how it is that eugenics believes itself to be progressive, and what does that mean and what do we make of that. And the second was a kind of an appreciation that in this room of the recognition of the contributions of the disability rights movement to people who are not necessarily visibly or at this moment disabled, and how the disability rights perspective illuminates much more than just addressing the conditions of people with disabilities. And then the third one was a comment that although it may be the case that race was not explicitly mentioned in any of the eugenics laws that were on the books in the States, that that racism, scientific racism and racism in general is so strongly connected with eugenics and eugenics thinking that that's something that we need to take much more into account.
Oh, we have probably a chance to field a couple more. All right.
Well, at our table, in addition to some of these issues that have already been mentioned, one of the issues that came up was the much greater priority in terms of funding given to research on prediction and prevention of various kinds of conditions, diseases, and disabilities, as opposed to research directed at improving the life of people with disabilities or with a variety of conditions. So the prediction and prevention has a much higher priority in terms of funding. Another issue that came up was the connection of hygiene and eugenics and the various metaphorical meanings of hygiene in relation to racism, the ideas of purity, and so forth. A third term, this is one of my personal ideas that really resonated, was the idea of humility. And this had come up several times in our discussions, a kind of humility toward the idea of so-called perfection and control, which were part of the values of eugenics, both historically and the new eugenics, perhaps, of today.
Great. We'll bounce here and then we'll bounce back.
Hi, Felicia Kornblue, University of Vermont. Something that we talked about that came up in Rosemarie Garland-Thomson's talk and also in Troy Duster was about eugenics and the struggle for resources and the economic, really underlining the economic piece of this, and what Troy Duster was saying about discourses around moochers and makers versus takers. That was really resonant for me and for some of the people here.
We talked about the power of personal narratives in overcoming the notion of othering people, and that's really, I think, what we talked about round and round in different ways.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. One of the members of our table is a high school physics teacher, and the statement that resonated for him was inclusive world building and accessible built environments and so on from Rosemarie's talk, and he has an assignment where he asks students to design or invent something. So it's practical, and they came up with a lot of very interesting solutions to the problems that they had identified. So I think that's a wonderful kind of hands-on way of approaching this issue. And then we also talked a bit about the efficacy, from Rob Wilson's talk, the efficacy of acknowledgement and apology. And we'd maybe like to hear a little bit more about that.
Great, thank you. Last one here, and then we'll kick it back to the panel.
We didn't actually get to discuss this, but it's something that I would love to bring into the conversation. Is I was really struck by the poster that you showed from the 1920s. Defining eugenics using a tree, and I'm really interested in the whole issue of how this all relates to nature in general and how we control nature, and then the whole issue of diversity and interdependence.
Thank you. One last one. Cicely.
Quick question. Peter Singer is an animal rights activist. How does that jive with his euthanasia stuff?
Great. A good thought-provoking way to end. So back to the panel.
Thank you. I think it's my job here. I want to assert a point of view about the community of people with disabilities worldwide. As veterans and newcomers alike, we get to feel infuriatingly frustrated at how slow things seem to have changed. And when you look at the successes of this amazing movement of people with disabilities, formerly less than 50 years old, having gone from the conditions that are being described pre-19th and pre-18th century, not a lot had changed the prior 2,000 years, and in the last 50 years or so, I believe us to be one of the most successful movements for liberation in the history of the world. And we have a long way to go. So I think I scribbled down all these amazing, wonderful points raised. I think we'd like to start with Rosemarie, addressing some of the issues around quality of life and some of the points that were raised. Dying to hear more from you.
Well, thank you. I think I'll start with the point that I actually ended up with, and that is that really bringing forward the inclusion of people with disabilities and other historically disadvantaged and excluded groups into the public sphere in lots of in every venue is the most, I think, important practice of micro-liberation, if you will. I just made up that word. Because people have been using the word microaggression a lot lately, so I want to have micro-liberation. At our table, we were talking about the cultural work of the pronouns we and they, and us and them. And to follow what Marsha's suggesting about the work of the larger civil and human rights movement worldwide, and the changes in legislation and practices and constitution of human communities that has come out of that, is really the only, I think the most promising way to address social inequality and social justice worldwide in general. And that just this room, that Marsha could say, for example, down the road is the Crippled Children's Hospital, where
it's been converted to an assisted living facility.
There you go. Yeah. Or this room at a major university, that it is filled with a diverse audience, diverse in many ways, is itself something that we should not lose track of. That something like what we call disability studies or African American studies or issues, women and gender studies, for example, that these are part of the institution of knowledge building and dissemination that has a great influence on the culture, on policy making in the culture, on attitudes in the culture. I don't think we want to underestimate the sort of micro-liberatory aspects of those initiatives, because I think we can become very discouraged and it can seem very overwhelming when we think of the tide of something like genetic counseling and these, what we're defining as eugenic practices, and how common they are, and the authority that comes from them. Listening to Glenn was very powerful because it became clear how strong an atmosphere of authority there was in that institution that made it difficult, if not impossible, to say no, or to have the perspective that said this is not right. And this occurs, I think, to all of us in our lives as we try to move through as subjects, that's the term we use, people with multiple identities, and how we navigate the world to incorporate the perspectives that can say no, the perspectives that can say this isn't right, the perspectives to say we ought to have a different kind of world, is really hard to do when you're inside of that fish tank that is the institution or the asylum or whatever institution it is. So, yay.
Trey.
Yeah, I'd like to respond. Is this on?
Push.
Is this on? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to respond to two different questions. The first was how there's a connection between eugenics and scientific racism. Most of us today think of race in terms of the 3 or 4 big ones, right? We think in terms of people of African descent, Asian descent, and European descent. So that's or sometimes people include Native Americans as a fourth. And that's such a common sense rendering of race. But what historians will tell you is that in 1905, Slavic race, Jewish race, Irish race were common language in the academy and in the common sense understanding of people in the society. There was something called a Jewish race in 1905. Now, in that period, 95% of blacks in America lived in the South. The South was still agrarian. It had not industrialized. And so what was happening was that as migration came in from Europe, the racism in science was about Europeans. It was not about blacks. So that's hard to fathom these days, that we didn't have an understanding of eugenics and race back in 1905 because, for the most part, blacks were not part of this industrial dramatic transformation that I mentioned. That occurred only with World War I, the mass migration beginning out of the South to the North. Then we begin to see racism take its form. Now, by the time we move into the late 20th century, we do have a version of this with the publication, for example, of the bell curve. And that's subtle because what in the bell curve, the argument was blacks have an inferior intellectual development. So IQ was seen as one of the issues. And that was fairly popular among certain people, certain parts of the population. So that the continuity between eugenics and scientific racism is there, but it takes a more subtle form than what one would expect. My other comment has to do with the question in the back of the room about individual decision-making versus state-mandated decision-making around policies to prevent births or sterilize. And the example I love to use is self-selection in India. Why? Because each family wants to think of itself as individual family, making a decision which is individual. But in fact, since about 1970, when amniocentesis and then later on the capacity to use ultrasound has invaded the Indian population, the birth rate of males over females has skyrocketed. And you can't explain that with individual decision making. That's the culture telling people as families that they should be having male babies. So what appears on the surface to be an individual decision is upon closer inspection a cultural imperative. I think the same is true for how we think about prenatal screening. At my table we talked about this, how in fact what appears on the surface to be individual decision making is in fact state mandated because every state in the union now has some form of prenatal screening. You give the information to the prospective parent and she or he then has to, quote, make a decision as individual. But you will find extraordinary patterns in decision making. So what appears on the surface to be individual decision making is upon closer inspection often social and cultural.
Yeah. Do we have another minute? I'd like to address the issue of acknowledgement and apology and reparations. Seems like we should include that here.
Yeah, I can say something briefly about that. I was actually just thinking about this right now and realizing we're getting close to being out of time. And I think that this might sound controversial, I guess. I don't think the apology itself is as important as the process of engaging in looking at an apology and the discussions that go around that. Because what happens when you force that discussion is then people have to raise these questions of who we are and what's our relationship to the past. Why should I apologize for something that happened 2 generations ago? what's my connection to various parts of the community. So it's important to go in sort of almost guerrilla warfare-like to that debate, I think, not to achieve the apology per se, though that can also be an accomplishment, but to really start to engage people around the very questions about community membership, about human diversity, variation, social inclusion, and so on. And it happens almost automatically because you get these pushbacks immediately from people as soon as those questions about apologies start to come up. And you already get some kind of acknowledgement of involvement as a part of that, or acknowledgement of the history as part of those discussions, and that's what's important about public engagement.